Hello, my friends. I want to begin by acknowledging an error I made previously, because intellectual honesty matters, especially in a conflict where misinformation has become a weapon. In an earlier analysis, I relied on a video that I believed, in good faith, to be authentic. It was not. It was an AI-generated fabrication. That mistake does not alter the underlying strategic reality of this war, but it does reinforce an important lesson. The information environment surrounding Ukraine has become so polluted that even experienced analysts must constantly guard against deception. This does not absolve me of responsibility, and I accept it fully. That said, the events of the past several days have rendered many of the narratives still circulating in Western media utterly indefensible. What we are witnessing now is not a temporary fluctuation on the battlefield, nor a momentary diplomatic impasse. It is the culmination of a strategic failure by the collective West. The United States and Europe have reached the absolute limits of what they are willing and able to give Ukraine. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent. Vast portions of Western military stockpiles have been transferred. Entire European economies have been damaged by sanctions imposed not on Russia, but on themselves. And despite all of this, the war continues to move decisively in Russia's favor. The momentum of Russian operations is no longer debatable. Even the most committed hardliners can no longer plausibly deny it. They may cling to comforting illusions, claims that Russia is exhausted, that Ukrainian counteroffensives are imminent, that key cities are about to be retaken, but the conviction behind those claims is evaporating. You could see that loss of conviction clearly in the recent meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. Zelensky arrived carrying the same set of proposals he has recycled throughout the year: a freeze along current lines, a ceasefire dressed up under various formulations, temporary pauses allegedly to facilitate referenda whose purpose remains obscure, security guarantees from the United States that would, in reality, amount to a de facto treaty alliance. 15-year guarantees, then 50-year guarantees, permanent commitments under another name. An 800,000-man army that Ukraine itself admits it cannot finance or sustain in peacetime. And of course, more money. Always more money. The Europeans backed him, as they always do, at least rhetorically. They helped shape these proposals. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, far more invested in Ukraine than in the worsening state of his own country, spoke with Zelensky just before the meeting. But this time, something was different. The energy was gone. The fervor had faded. Trump did not concede to any of these demands. He did not escalate sanctions. He did not threaten Russia's oil exports. He did not recommit the United States to an unwinnable proxy war. Instead, he spoke bluntly. Ukraine is losing Donbass. Decisions must be made. The road ahead is narrowing. And perhaps more revealing than words were expressions. Trump appeared calm, controlled, unsurprised. Zelensky looked exhausted physically and politically. The unspoken message was unmistakable. The era of blank checks is ending. This shift did not happen in a vacuum. On the eve of his meeting with Zelensky, Trump spoke directly with Vladimir Putin. According to Russian accounts, the conversation was cordial, constructive, and substantive. Putin explained the military reality on the ground. He made it clear that temporary ceasefires and cosmetic freezes would not resolve the conflict. Only a final settlement could do that. Trump, for the first time, appeared to be listening more closely to Moscow than to Kyiv. And the military reality Putin described is devastating for Ukraine. Over the past 2 days, Russian generals have delivered what may be the most dramatic battlefield briefings of the entire war. Entire urban clusters in Donbass have collapsed. Stepnogorsk in Zaporozhye has fallen. Gulyai-Pol has been captured. Mirnograd, the eastern half of the Pokrovsk agglomeration, is under full Russian control. Rodinsky, a significant mining town, has fallen as well. Ukrainian denials followed immediately, as they always do. Western media echoed them uncritically, as it always does. But Russian footage soon emerged, flags raised across multiple districts simultaneously in multiple towns. That kind of evidence is difficult to refute. The pattern is unmistakable. Ukrainian defenses did not merely retreat, they collapsed. South of Zaporozhye city, Ukrainian fortified lines along the Geishu River have disintegrated. Russian forward units are now within 15 kilometers of the city itself. This does not mean an immediate assault, but it does mean the operation has entered its final preparatory phase. The Russian General Staff has clearly drawn up plans for the capture of Zaporozhye and Kherson, and Putin has made it clear that these objectives remain firmly in place. Elsewhere, Russian forces are advancing towards Slavyansk. Lyman is being fought over street by street, with supply routes already cut east of the Oskol River. Ukrainian formations are surrounded, reduced, and steadily eliminated. In Sumy region, Russian forces are now within 20 kilometers of the city. The language of buffer zones persists, but this is diplomatic code, not operational reality. If the war continues, those buffer zones will become permanent frontiers. Putin made a telling remark during one of these briefings. He said that Russia's interest in negotiating Ukrainian withdrawals is approaching zero. The meaning is clear. Kiev missed its opportunity. When Moscow proposed terms, what I have described as Istanbul plus Ukraine, still controlled significant territory. That territory could have been used as leverage. Instead, Kiev chose denial. Now, the leverage is gone. What we are seeing now is not a stalemate breaking, but a war concluding on the battlefield. Donbass is effectively decided. Zaporozhye is next. Once Zaporozhye city is threatened directly, Ukrainian positions along the Black Sea from Nikolaev to Odessa become increasingly untenable. At the same time, the Ukrainian state itself is fraying. Desertions are accelerating. Morale is collapsing. Even senior Ukrainian officials are beginning to admit the truth. Kirill Budanov, once among the most uncompromising hardliners, has publicly acknowledged that Ukraine is losing and that any peace will be dictated on Russian terms. Zelensky, however, remains trapped by his own mythology. He still seems to believe that one more maneuver, one more appeal, one more Western intervention will change the outcome. If that fails, I suspect his priority will be personal survival, financial and political, rather than national reconstruction. Political knives are already being sharpened in Kyiv. Anti-corruption probes are resurfacing. Valery Zaluzhny's return from London signals a brewing power struggle. Budanov's interview was not merely analytical, it was political. Zelensky's position is eroding as rapidly as Ukraine's front lines. As for negotiations, I have no expectation that they will succeed. The proposed working groups, American, Russian, Ukrainian, might have mattered months ago. Today, they are already being overtaken by events. Wars end, either at the negotiating table or on the battlefield. Ukraine chose the latter by denying reality for too long. We are approaching the final tipping point of this conflict. Not tomorrow, not next week, but the trajectory is now irreversible. In 2026, this war will end not because Kyiv wants it to, but because it no longer has the capacity to continue. That is the reality. And no amount of rhetoric, spin, or denial will change it. What we are witnessing in Ukraine is not merely the collapse of a front line or the failure of a single government. It is the unraveling of an entire Western strategic illusion, one that has been sustained for nearly 3 years through propaganda, denial, and an extraordinary suppression of inconvenient facts. At its core, this war was never about Ukraine's sovereignty. It was about whether the United States and its European satellites could impose a new security architecture on Eurasia by force, using Ukraine as a proxy battering ram against Russia. That project has now failed. Not partially, not temporarily. It has failed structurally. The reason is simple. The West fundamentally misunderstood the nature of Russian power. Western planners assumed that Russia was a brittle state, economically fragile, socially divided, militarily incompetent, and politically unstable. They believed sanctions would cause internal collapse, that battlefield pressure would fracture elite cohesion, and that time was on their side. Every one of those assumptions has proven false. Russia approached this war not as a limited expedition, but as an existential security struggle. From the beginning, Moscow understood that it was not fighting Ukraine alone, but the collective industrial, financial, and intelligence apparatus of NATO. That understanding shaped Russian decision-making at every level, from force generation and logistics to operational tempo and strategic patience. Ukraine, by contrast, has been treated as a consumable asset. The Ukrainian army has not been built to win. It has been built to bleed. Its function, from a Western perspective, was to absorb Russian firepower, degrade Russian stocks, and buy time for sanctions to work. Ukrainian manpower was the expendable variable. Western lives were never at stake. Ukrainian lives always were. That brutal reality is now catching up with Kyiv. The Ukrainian state is collapsing from the inside out, not because its soldiers lack courage, many have fought bravely, but because courage cannot compensate for strategic bankruptcy. The manpower crisis alone is terminal. Forced mobilizations, street kidnappings, the deployment of older men and untrained recruits, these are not signs of resilience. They are signs of exhaustion. And exhaustion, once it sets in at scale, cannot be reversed. The battlefield collapses we are seeing in Donbass and Zaporozhye are not isolated failures. They are cascading system failures. Once one fortified line gives way, the entire defensive depth behind it becomes vulnerable. Once command cohesion breaks, units begin to dissolve. Once soldiers believe that their sacrifices no longer serve a plausible objective, desertion becomes rational behavior. This is precisely what is happening now. Russia, meanwhile, has solved the war at the level that actually matters: industrial warfare. While Western analysts obsessed over individual weapon systems, tanks, missiles, aircraft, Russia focused on scale, sustainability, and integration. Artillery production, drone swarms, electronic warfare, layered air defense, logistics redundancy, training pipelines. This is why Russian advances, while often methodical rather than flashy, have proven unstoppable. Ukraine does not lose because it lacks Western technology. It loses because it cannot replace destroyed units at the rate Russia can destroy them. Attrition favors the side with depth. Russia has depth. Ukraine does not, and Europe certainly does not. The European role in this war has been particularly self-destructive. European leaders convinced themselves that moral posturing could substitute for strategic calculation. They sanctioned their own energy supplies. They deindustrialized their own economies. They borrowed massive sums to finance a war they could not win. And now they are discovering that the bill has come due. The 90 billion loan packages, floated as acts of solidarity, are in reality acts of desperation. They are not investments, they are sunk costs. Even European officials privately acknowledge that Ukraine will never repay them. These loans exist primarily to delay political reckoning within Europe itself. But delay is not resolution. In the United States, a similar reckoning is underway. The political class senses that public tolerance for this war is evaporating. There is no appetite for direct intervention, no appetite for escalation with a nuclear power, and no appetite for endless funding of a conflict that produces no strategic gain. This is why the shift in Washington matters, not because of personalities, but because institutions are recalibrating. The Pentagon understands that Ukraine cannot win. Intelligence agencies understand that Russian escalation dominance remains intact. Financial authorities understand that sanctions have plateaued in effectiveness. Zelensky, however, remains frozen in a narrative that no longer exists. He continues to behave as if rhetorical pressure can override material reality, as if more speeches, more summits, more demands can reverse battlefield physics. They cannot. War is not decided by narratives. It is decided by logistics, manpower, morale, and time. On every one of those axes, Ukraine is losing and losing faster now than at any previous point in the conflict. The most tragic dimension of this war is that Ukraine had off-ramps, multiple ones. Negotiations in early 2022, later settlement proposals, opportunities to trade territory for survival. Each time, Western encouragement pushed Kyiv toward maximalism. Each time, Ukraine chose to fight on until fighting on became impossible. Now, the negotiations being discussed are not peace talks, they are surrender management, and even those may arrive too late. Russia is no longer negotiating from concern, it is negotiating from dominance. The longer this war continues, the less incentive Moscow has to compromise. Territory taken by force does not need to be bargained for. It only needs to be consolidated. That is the fundamental shift many in the West still refuse to accept. This war is ending not because diplomacy is succeeding, but because Ukrainian capacity is collapsing. Political crises in Kyiv will intensify. Power struggles will erupt. Blame will be assigned. Scapegoats will be chosen, and eventually someone will have to sign what Zelensky refused to sign earlier, only under far worse conditions. History will judge this war harshly. Not because Ukraine resisted Russia, but because Western leaders encouraged resistance without providing a path to victory, while silencing those who warned of the inevitable outcome. The tragedy is not that Russia prevailed. The tragedy is that Ukraine was sacrificed to prove a theory that never worked. And now, reality has returned with a vengeance. We are now entering the final phase of this war, the phase in which denial no longer functions as policy and illusion no longer functions as strategy. Reality, patient and indifferent, has arrived to collect its debt. And unlike propaganda, reality does not negotiate, does not compromise, and does not retreat because it is inconvenient. What has unfolded in Ukraine is not simply the failure of a military campaign. It is the failure of an entire worldview, a worldview that assumed Western power was unlimited, Western judgment infallible, and Western intervention inherently virtuous. That worldview is now broken, and Ukraine is where it broke. For nearly 3 years, Western leaders insisted that Ukraine could still win if only the next delivery arrived. The next weapon system, the next tranche of funding, the next escalation step short of direct war. Each delay was framed as strategy. Each retreat was presented as prudence. Each defeat was rebranded as resilience. But no narrative, however skillfully constructed, can compensate for a collapsing material foundation. Wars are not won by belief. They are won by endurance. Ukraine's endurance has been exhausted. Its manpower pool is depleted. Its economy is hollowed out. Its society is fractured by grief, immigration, and despair. Its army, once motivated by the belief that victory was possible, now fights largely to survive withdrawal rather than to advance. This is not a moral judgment. It is a strategic diagnosis. No state can sustain war indefinitely when its losses exceed its capacity to replace them. Russia understood this from the beginning. Moscow approached this conflict as a war of attrition, not because it lacked alternatives, but because attrition favored it structurally. Russia had strategic depth, industrial capacity, demographic resilience, and escalation dominance. It did not need spectacular breakthroughs. It needed time. And time, slowly but relentlessly, did its work. Russian strategy was never about speed. It was about inevitability. The battlefield has now made that inevitability unmistakable. Donbass is effectively decided. Zaporizhzhia is no longer a distant objective, but an approaching reality. Ukrainian defensive systems are failing not at one point, but across entire sectors simultaneously. Command cohesion is eroding. Morale is breaking. Once these processes accelerate, they cannot be reversed by diplomacy, because diplomacy cannot generate battalions, restore morale, or rebuild destroyed defenses in real time. Negotiations, if they proceed, will therefore not shape the outcome. They will document it. Beyond Ukraine itself, the implications of this war are vast and enduring. The post-Cold War European security architecture, the system built on NATO expansion, Russian marginalization, and American primacy, is finished. Not weakened, finished. It rested on the assumption that Russia could be permanently constrained without consequence. That assumption has now been disproven at enormous cost. A new security order will emerge, not because anyone formally designs it, but because power realities impose it. Russia will be central to that order, not because it seeks recognition, but because it has demonstrated the capacity to enforce its interests. Europe will have to adapt to this reality, whether it does so pragmatically or resentfully. The alternative is permanent instability on its eastern frontier. This war has also redefined the meaning of Western guarantees. Ukraine believed it possessed firm commitments. What it actually had were conditional assurances subject to political fatigue, electoral cycles, and risk thresholds. When escalation began to threaten Western comfort rather than Ukrainian survival, the limits of solidarity became visible. Other states are learning from this. They are learning that alignment with the West does not guarantee protection in existential conflicts. They are learning that proxy status carries asymmetric risk, and they are learning that Western moral rhetoric often exceeds Western willingness to absorb cost. These lessons will shape global behavior for decades. Equally significant is the collapse of the moral narrative that framed this war. The West claimed to defend international law while openly discussing asset seizures and legal exceptionalism. It claimed to oppose escalation while steadily expanding the scope of the conflict. It claimed to protect civilians while encouraging a war that consumed an entire generation of Ukrainians. Moral authority cannot survive such contradictions indefinitely. Eventually, credibility erodes. Europe, in particular, has not yet begun to reckon with the damage it has inflicted upon itself. Energy security was sacrificed, industrial competitiveness was undermined, strategic autonomy was abandoned. European publics were told that hardship was the price of values, only to discover that those values did not produce victory, security, or stability. That gap between promise and outcome will define European politics for years to come. As for Ukraine, the most difficult chapter has yet to be written. Reconstruction without sovereignty, recovery without demographic strength, political renewal amid trauma and bitterness. These are burdens that no aid package can erase. Ukraine did not lose because it lacked courage. It lost because it was instrumentalized, used to test sanctions, used to weaken a rival, used to sustain an illusion of Western dominance long after that dominance had begun to erode. History will not remember this war as a noble defense of democracy. It will remember it as a proxy conflict in which a nation was encouraged to fight beyond the limits of reason, denied the freedom to compromise when compromise was still possible, and left to absorb the consequences alone once reality asserted itself. Wars do not end when one side runs out of arguments. They end when one side runs out of options. Ukraine is now at that point. The final tragedy is not that Russia imposed its will. The final tragedy is that this outcome was foreseeable, warned about, and avoidable, yet denial prevailed until denial itself became catastrophic. And in the end, the price of that refusal to face reality was not paid in Washington, Brussels, or London. It was paid in Kiev. That is the final reckoning of this war.